Hello and welcome to Polyglot Principles. My name is Modja, and in this channel I help you to learn a language like a genius by teaching you the principles of language learning. Welcome once again. And today's video is about, the title is about mixing up languages, right? So perhaps you've noticed this. Maybe you speak more than one language and you notice that sometimes you find yourself mixing up languages. You're speaking English and then you find French coming in. Maybe you're speaking Spanish and then, your English comes and interferes. So the natural question is, well, what is this whole mixing up of languages all about? What brings it about, and how can I avoid it, for example, right? That's typically the kind of thing people are interested in, right? And it's an interesting question to me as well. And this is what this video is about. And I'm going to be sharing very useful information right through to the end. So make sure to watch right through to the end. Otherwise, you'll miss out on some very useful stuff. All right. So, as usual, before we start, I do have a question for you. Why do you think polyglots mix up languages, right? A polyglot, anyone who speaks more than one language. Why do you think polyglots, or people who speak more than one language, why do you think they mix up languages? Right, think about it, pause this video, think about the question, write it down in the comment section below, and then come back and continue watching, and let's find out if your answer agrees with mine, alright? This is going to be an interesting exercise, and I really want to know what you're thinking about. Alright, let's dig into this now. So, the first thing to note here, right? The first thing to note is that mixing up languages is not necessarily a bad thing, right? Usually we see it as a bad thing. It's like, oh no, I'm mixing up languages. I'm supposed to be speaking French, but there's Kiswahili in my French. I'm supposed to be speaking German, but there is English mixed up with my German. That's wrong. Well, not necessarily, right? Let's start with that first of all. One thing you're going to notice is that every language is a mix of other languages, right? If you look at the English language carefully, you'll realize it's made up of other languages, right? English comes from German, right? That's why they call English a Germanic language. There's a lot of words in English that come from German, right? Stuff like kindergarten, right? Straight from German. At least I think it's straight from German. It's definitely a German word, right? So somebody borrowed it from someone, but in either way, right? So English is being made up of made up of many other languages, right? So there are words in English that come from French, like rendezvous, right? Rendezvous meaning meeting, right? That's a French word, right? And you're going to find all sorts of other words coming from other languages. So there's no such thing really as pure English. English is made up of many other languages. It's a mixture of languages. And any language, like even Chinese. Right? Think about the Chinese language, right? A lot of the words for internet, like computer-related stuff, are English words. So even Chinese is not pure. All the languages are made up of other languages. So mixing is not a bad thing, right? In fact, one thing to note is that if a language is always in flux, it's always learning from other cultures. Once it stops that, it has actually begun to die, right? Because society changes, we discover new things, and we need new words, and sometimes we have to borrow them, etc. So mixing in itself is not a bad thing, just from the point of view that every language is really a mixture of other languages. And here's the other thing. What is the point? What is the goal of communication? What is the goal of a language? What's the point of a language? The point of a language, or the value of a language, is in its ability to take a thought that's in my brain and implant it into somebody else's brain. If I have a thought and I want you to know what that thought is, I want to communicate the thought to you, well, anything that enables me to transfer a thought from my brain into your brain is what we call a language, right? So, and sorry, one moment. Oui? Okay, merci. Yeah. So I lost my train of thought a bit there, right? So the essential, let's not forget the essential. The reason you're learning a language the primary reason is not just because it sounds beautiful, to be grammatically perfect. The primary goal of a language, as I've said in many of my videos, is the primary goal of a language is to transfer a thought from your brain into another person's brain, right? If you do that, you've succeeded, right? And so, I mean, think about this, right? For example, in a place like Congo, we speak, like the place where I live right now in Congo, a place called Bunya, we speak, here people speak English and they also, sorry, not English, they speak French and they also speak Swahili. It's common to find people mixing up the languages. When someone is speaking English, you'll hear them, when someone is speaking Swahili, you'll hear them using French words. When someone is speaking French, they might put in some Swahili words inside, right? That sort of thing happens. Now, if you're a purist, you would say, oh, that's evil. That's so not evil, but that's that's wrong. You shouldn't mix up languages. If you're speaking Swahili, only speak Swahili. If you're speaking French, only speak French. But it's not really the case. You know, the point is to communicate, right? So people here will use a mixture of French and Swahili, and it works perfectly fine. The beauty of this is that if you know French, and maybe you don't, if you don't know French very well and you don't know Swahili very well, thanks to the phenomenon of mixing, you can communicate with people here. You can start speaking French, and if you get stuck, you just throw in a Swahili word. Or you're speaking Swahili, you get stuck, you throw in a French word, right? So actually, the mixing up of languages is enabling you to communicate better, right? So in certain cases, when your goal is purely communication, for example, you've traveled to a new country and you're a tourist. Let's say you travel to Bunya to visit, the place where I live. You travel to Bunya to visit, okay? And you know French, a bit of French, and you know a bit of Swahili. If you decide to be a purist and say, I'm only going to talk in French, you're gonna be in trouble. You'll reach a point where you can't communicate ideas, right? And the reason you're not able to communicate ideas is because you've taught yourself, you believe that it's a bad thing to mix up languages, right? But if you let go of that belief, then you're able to communicate more easily, right? Because you'll just start speaking in French, and then when you get stuck, put in some Swahili, right? So this is the first thing to realize. It's not necessarily bad to mix up languages, right? It doesn't mean that you should always mix up languages, but it's not necessarily a bad thing, right? So long as, here's the thing that, here's the main condition. If, let's say, I speak English and I speak German, and you speak English and German as well, then it's okay for me to speak to you with mixing up the languages. Maybe there's some idea that it's better expressed using a German word, so I put the German word there. So long as you and I understand both languages, this works, right? The mixing actually helps us to communicate at a deeper level. And we've created our own meta language, which is a mixture of German and English, right? So this is actually interesting, right? But now here comes the problem. Here's where mixing languages might not work. What if I speak English and German, but you only speak English? Now if I started mixing up English and German, I will not be able to communicate with you, right? Because you don't speak German. If I use German words, you just won't understand. The mixing only works so long as we have the same language, right? So this is now where we get the importance of learning how to speak a pure language. Like, just speak German without mixing with anything, or you speak French and you don't mix it up with English, because not everybody understands the mixture of languages, right? So let's get into this mixing, right? Let's understand first of all, because we want to understand, how can I stop myself? This is probably happening to you. How do I stop myself from mixing up languages? But in order to understand how to stop myself from mixing up languages, it's important to understand, why do I mix up languages in the first place? How does this mixing happen? So let's go into that. Well, here's the first thing to notice. Your brain or your mind does not automatically distinguish between languages. This is one of the key reasons why mixing up is happening. Right, you'd think to yourself, my brain knows that English is different from German. My brain knows that German is different from Spanish, and so they're totally different, and the brain knows that. Actually, your mind does not know that, right? For example, right, if you speak English, there's the word I. If you speak Spanish, the word for I is yo, right? Depending on pronunciation, people say yo, but I, Joe means the same thing. Moi in French, still, moi, or je, which is I, right? Ich in German, still I. Imagine that you speak these 4 languages, right? As far as your brain is concerned, all of these words mean the same thing. Ich, I, jo, moi, all of them are the same, right? As far as your mind is concerned. These are not different words. They are all equivalent ways of expressing the same idea. So whenever you start, that means that when you start speaking and you're trying to express, let's say, the concept of I, your brain actually has to select among all the options. Your mind has to select among all the options for I. If you only speak one language, it's easy. If you only speak English, then obviously there's no option. You say I. But if you speak 7 languages, there's 7 options to choose from. This is part of where the confusion comes from, right? But your brain is not really separating between this. Here's what I mean if we're to go a little more into detail, right, when it comes to this. For example, let's just look at English, right? The word go up, the word rise. Let's say you're describing a graph. It goes, let's say you're describing what? The birth rate. You could say the birth rate is going up, the birth rate is rising, the birth rate is increasing, the birth rate is augmenting. These words, go up, rise, increase, augment, they're synonyms. They kind of mean the same thing. As far as your mind is concerned, these words are equivalent, right? So when you start to speak, whichever one of these words comes up first in your mind, that's the one that is going to be used. If you're speaking and the word go up comes first, you're going to say go up. If you're speaking and the word rise comes, you're going to use the word rise or increase, right? And why is your mind doing this? It's doing this because it's more efficient. It's more efficient to use the word that comes up first as opposed to looking for a different word, right? So your language knows your mind knows all these words: go up, rise, increase, augment. As far as your mind is concerned, these all are just different ways of expressing the same idea. They're equivalent, right? But the really interesting thing is that your mind, when it comes to different languages, the mind is behaving the same way. Ich, jo, moi, ngai, all those words for I are also being considered just the way you considered. In the same language, you could consider synonyms. These words that come from different languages, the mind is still considering them as synonyms. And why not? They're just equivalent ways of expressing the same thing. Here's what that means. If you start to speak in a language, right? Let's say I'm speaking to you in English right now, and then I reach a point and I need to say I. But the word that pops up to my mind first is Joe. I'll find myself saying Joe. Now I've mixed up English and Spanish, right? Why? And this is again same principle of efficiency. I'm trying to speak, I'm trying to get my idea across as fast as possible and in the most efficient way possible. So my mind is like, hey, this guy wants to talk about I, okay, and look, the word that came up is Joe. Let's use Joe. Or the word that came up is Ish. Let's use Ish. Why not? After all, these words are synonyms. Ish, Joe, I are synonyms. Let me use the one that comes up first and save energy, instead of spending time trying to think and sift through and just pick the one in the particular language. So what happens is when you start trying to speak fast or at a normal pace in languages, this is part of what's creating the mixing. You have many options in your mind for expressing the same concept. Your mind is viewing them as equivalent and picking whichever one comes up first, right? And so you end up just mixing up languages, right? So this is one of the key reasons why, right? So your language does not. That's why I was saying that your mind does not automatically distinguish between languages. You have to put in the effort to distinguish. You kind of have to teach your brain to only use English words when you're speaking English, and to shut out German words, and when you're speaking German, shut out English words. All right? So, but let's go a little deeper. We said that whichever word comes up to your brain first, to your whatever word is at the front of your mind, that's the word that you're going to use, right? Just if the mind is trying to be efficient here. Right, so, but what determines what words come up first? Because what you'd really like to do is that when you're speaking, When you're speaking English, the words that come up to your mind, you only want them to be English words. You don't want a German word to be showing up at the front of your mind, because then you're going to mix up, right? You're going to mix, when you're speaking, you're going to start mixing up or confusing English and German, for example, right? So the question is, well, what are the factors that make a word come up as the first option? For example, we're saying just with the English language itself, there's the word go up, rise, increase, augment. When you're starting to speak and you need to express this concept of becoming greater and greater, one of the words is going to show up first in your mind, right? But the question is, well, what determines which word shows up first? What are the factors that determine which word is going to show up first? That's what we're going to go into. Because if we know these factors, then we can figure out exactly how to ensure that only the words that show up are the ones in the language that you want to speak. Right, so let's go into this. How does the selection happen? Right, what makes the word come up first? And there's a variety of factors. The first factor is just frequency. Right, what do I mean by this? This basically means that if you have been using a particular word, if you frequently use a particular word, then when you get into a context where you need to use that word, automatically that word is gonna show up in your mind, right? So for example, if let's say I'm speaking English, right, I have to use the word I use the word I so many times. So which means just out of frequency, if I come into a situation where I need to talk again about myself, automatically the first word that's going to come to my mind is I, because I've been using it frequently. Of course, you can see the consequences of this, right? Imagine if you've not been speaking a language for a long time, like you haven't spoken Spanish, right? Let's say you know Spanish, but you haven't spoken Spanish for 2 years, right? This word, let's say Joe, for example, a word like Joe for meaning I, you have not used that word. First of all, that word has not been frequently used for you, right? It's been a long time that you haven't used that word frequently. So what's going to happen? Well, when it comes time to express the concept of myself, Joe is not going to show up at the front of your mind. What's going to show up is I or ish or whatever you most frequently use in other languages. So this is one of the factors, right? So obviously this tells you what you need to do, right? One of the things is, if you want to avoid mixing up languages, obviously you want to make sure that you're using the language in question frequently and you're using words of that language frequently. Because the more you use these words frequently, the more likely they are to show up as the first option in your mind. So you'll find yourself just speaking purely in the language that you want to speak. All right. The other factor that determines what word shows up at the front of your mind is what we call recency. Right? So recency means just like how recently, right? How close to this moment, how close in the past to this moment did you use this particular word, right? There are certain words maybe you used to use a lot when you were a kid. Maybe, I don't know what, maybe when you were in primary school, in elementary school, you guys learned a new word like bamboozle. Okay, you learned the word bamboozle, right? Which means to surprise someone, right? Bamboozle. And maybe for like 2 weeks, you used the word bamboozle a lot. You kept talking to your relatives and telling them, wow, do you know what bamboozle means? So you use the word bamboozle frequently for a while, right? But after those 2 weeks, maybe you spent a month without using the word. Sure, you've used the word bamboozle frequently, but when you start to speak and you want to express the concept of surprise, astonishment, the word that comes to the front of your mind is not going to be bamboozle, because it's not the word that you've been recently using, right? Instead, the word that's going to come up is the one that you use frequently or the one that you've been using recently, right? This is why, like, even if I know a language really well, let's say I know like Spanish really well, I've really spent time, I've learned my Spanish, I have it down. And all of the words, the important words in Spanish, I have used them frequently enough to the point where they've been burned into my brain, totally burned into my nervous system, right? You'd think, okay, great. Now that means that even if I spend like 2 years, I'll still be able to use the language, I'll be able to speak Spanish fluently. That's not what's going to happen. Why? Although I've used the words frequently, I haven't used them recently enough. In the last 1 year, I haven't really used the language at all. So all those words are kept at the back of the mind, not at the front. So when I try to speak Spanish, what's going to happen is that another language which I use more frequently and has been used more recently is gonna, whenever I get stuck in Spanish, I'm gonna plug in those words from that language. So now I'm gonna experience mixing again, a big problem, right? So obviously, again, this gives you a tip, right? If you wanna make sure that you don't mix a language, mix up languages, and whatever language it is that you want to speak purely without any mixing, make sure that you avoid make sure that you not only use it frequently, but make sure that you use it often, right? Sorry, often and frequently are the same, but make sure it's recent. Don't spend a long time without using the language, right? Don't go like a week, a month without using the language, and then you expect that the first time you open your mouth, things are going to be fluent. That's not how it works, right? So that's the second factor. Well, what's another factor, right? There's a third factor that determines mixing, what causes you to mix languages together. So the third factor is just proficiency, right? Basically, if you're not proficient in a language, you're more likely to use another language that you're more proficient in to help you. So you're going to mix up languages. And I mean, like, a very powerful demonstration of this is when you start learning a new language, right? Let's say you've never spoken German in your life before. You're just learning German. And let's say you speak English fluently. Here's what's going to happen. When you try to start speaking German, you're not proficient in German at all, but you're super proficient in English. So what will happen is you might start speaking in German. Maybe you'll say one word like ish, and then you'll get stuck. And then to communicate your idea, you'll start using English, right? You're mixing up English and German. And the mixing is happening because you're proficient in English and you're not proficient in German. So naturally, because you're trying to communicate an idea, the natural thing is to use what you know, your proficiency, as a crutch, right? And this can happen, like, this actually can hinder you from ever learning a language, right? There's people, for example, who, the person is a conversation partner. They're supposed to be learning English, and let's say they're a German native speaker. They're supposed to be learning English, but the entire time they've been speaking in German, they've barely spoken English because they're using their German as a crutch. They're actually mixing up the languages because they're they're not proficient in English, but they're super proficient in German. And as a result, they just end up never learning the language, right? So this gives us a tip. If you want to become capable, if you want to avoid mixing languages so that you can focus on one language and learn it well, one of the simple things to do is you really want to restrict yourself. Stop yourself from using the languages you're more proficient in. If I'm learning German, just focus on using German words. If you get stuck, use German. Avoid totally using English or any other language, right? This is not just for German, it's for whatever you're learning, right? So if you're learning Chinese and you're a fluent Spanish speaker, well then, make sure that whenever you're speaking Chinese, totally ban yourself from using any Spanish. Because if you don't do that, the natural tendency is your mind is going to use Spanish, which is easier. You already know it. Again, this is another demonstration of the principle of efficiency of the mind. Your mind is efficient. It wants to achieve results, but by applying the least amount of effort. The principle is basically laziness. The mind is lazy, right? So if you're trying to express an idea and you can't express it in Chinese, the mind is like, well, but I know how to say it in Spanish, so you're going to use Spanish. So you find yourself mixing up Spanish and Chinese, and eventually, if you don't set clear boundaries to yourself that you're only going to use Chinese, and if you're stuck, you figure out a way to say it in Chinese. If you don't set that boundary, then good luck. You're never going to learn whatever the language is. In this case, it's going to be Chinese. All right? So there's another factor. So this was proficiency, right? The proficiency makes you mix things. Mix up things in a language, because one language is trying to help out where the other language is weak. Whatever language you're proficient at is trying to help out in the language where you're not proficient. All right, so we've passed that, right? Here's the other reason why what causes certain words or certain language to be, this is another factor that causes words to show up at the front of your mind, right? And causes mixing as a result, is there's such a thing as, I call it the discrimination muscle, right? Like I was telling you before, the mind does not automatically distinguish between languages. The mind is just trying to get a thought from your brain into another brain. And whatever way is efficient to do it, it's going to do that. So if it has to say, like, let's say, for example, I am going, let's say the word for, the German word for I is ich, right? If you say ich, go to school, okay? A proper German person will say, no, you've used too many English words. A proper English speaker will say, no, you don't say ich, you say I. But as far as your mind is concerned, you've communicated an idea. Ich, go to school. Ich is I, the equivalent, right? It automatically, the mind is just going to pick whatever words in whatever language to communicate the idea. It's not going to distinguish them naturally. So if you want to distinguish languages in your brain and make sure that English is on one side and Spanish is on one side and German is on one side and they never get mixed up, you have to exercise the discrimination muscle, right? So for example, I speak like 7 languages at this point, right? So every time when I want to say something like I, my mind has to sift through all the possibilities, I have many possibilities of words. I, ich, jo, nze, ngai, like 7 possibilities. I need to train myself to shut down all the other possibilities. If I'm speaking German, I need to discriminate. I need to use my discrimination muscle to discriminate against all the other possibilities and only pick the German word, ich. And when I'm speaking English, I want to use this muscle to discriminate against every other language, right? So that I only select German words, right? And one thing to note is that this mixing is bidirectional. What I mean, this muscle I'm talking about, discrimination, is bidirectional. I'll give you an example. For example, in Congo, right? In Congo, for example, here where I live right now, we speak French and Swahili. So typically what happens is, if I'm speaking to people in Swahili, I mix up Swahili and French, right? I can speak in Swahili, and then if I feel like it, if I'm, let's say, stuck and I don't know how to say it in Swahili, I just throw a French word in and the people understand, because they speak English, they speak French, and they speak Swahili, right? So in this case, I am not when I'm speaking Swahili, I am not discriminating. I'm not using my discriminating muscle to discriminate against French. Basically, I'm allowing French words to come in. So I'm speaking a new language, a mixture of Swahili and French. But, so I'm not allowing words to flow from French to Swahili. But here's what happens. When I speak French, typically I don't want any Swahili words to come in. So I'm discriminating against Swahili, but I'm not discriminating against French, right? This is what I mean by the bidirectional, right? This is the beauty of it. You could allow yourself to mix French words into Swahili, but then reject Swahili words mixing into French. You could do that if you like, right? But obviously, if you want to speak Swahili separately and French separately, you have to put in the effort to block. To whenever you speak French, block out Swahili. Whenever you speak Swahili, block out French, right? I notice this a lot, right? So for example, I already know Spanish, right? I speak Spanish at a fluent level. Now, obviously, I haven't used it in a long while, right? Because I really literally have no need for it at this moment, right? But I've been learning German, and I noticed once I had to do like some interview someone in Spanish, so I had to like bring the language back quickly, right? Because I'd forgotten it. I had to bring it back quickly. But I noticed that every time I was speaking Spanish, I was using German. German words were interfering with my Spanish. At every time I kept getting German words into my Spanish, right? I was speaking a mixture of Spanish and German. But interestingly enough, and the reason this happened is because when I was learning Spanish, I didn't know German yet. I never practiced discriminating out German words from Spanish words when I was learning Spanish. So what happened when I started speaking Spanish, my mind was like, oh, you're stuck, you don't know what word to use, the German word just came in. But interestingly enough, when I was speaking German, right? When I was speaking German, it was very rare for a Spanish word to interfere. Spanish didn't interfere with my German. And the reason was because when I was learning German, I taught myself to cut out all the other languages I know, discriminate them out. So this is an interesting case where I allowed German to go into Spanish, but I did not allow Spanish to go into German, right? So I applied the discrimination muscle in only one direction. So it's up to you. Maybe you want to apply it in one direction or you want to apply it in both directions. You want to keep every language pure and stop yourself from mixing, right? So, but the natural tendency of the mind is to mix up. And the reason is because it's more efficient to mix up, to say whatever is convenient, as opposed to restricting, cutting out an entire language and forcing yourself to focus on only one. So this is the difficulty of being a polyglot. All right. So look, I hope this video was valuable to you. It was very intense, very deep, but this is the style I prefer. You know, I like us to go deep into details so we can really understand the principles of language learning. Right? I want to make sure that at the end of this video you come out with a lot of value. At the end of every video you come out with a lot of value. I think that's what it's about. Otherwise, why make the goddamn videos? All right. So look, every Monday at 8 a.m. Central African time, I publish a video, and the video is designed to teach you the principles that will help you to learn a language like a genius. Right. So if you want to receive those videos, please make sure to give this video a thumbs up. Make sure you like it, hit the subscribe button, and hit the bell notification. Ding, 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 ding. That way you'll be notified whenever I come up with a new video. Thank you very much for watching this video and hope to catch you on the next one. Bye.